This program is about Lueta Bailey, and I want you to about the backstory. In 1981, just about the same time Episcopal Women's History Project was founded, Charlie Sumners, my husband, asked Hugh Downs, a lifetime Episcopalian, to interview the former presiding bishop, John Hines, to tell about his life from childhood to his journey as presiding bishop. This conversation lasted for a long time. Charlie intended to tell this story to the Episcopal Church at large, but life got complicated and many years went by. Bishop Hines died, but his story was much alive. So in 2009, we went to General Convention in Anaheim and interviewed close to 30 people who had known the bishop, and they were delighted to tell their personal stories about him. Their memories were wonderful. In 2012, we went to General Convention in Indianapolis and found another bunch of storytellers. And from there, we head out for a 5-week-long journey to see if we could find some of the major people who had worked with Bishop Hines. To our delight, we found some people we thought were the closest to the bishop. And from then, we started a full-length film that was called Justice is the Corporate Face of Love. In this journey, we discovered that several key people were still alive, people who were important to the Hines story, stories that were woven as a part of a tapestry. And one of the most remarkable persons we met was Lueta Bailey. She still lived in Griffins, Georgia, and was still an active Episcopalian. She asked if she would do an interview for us, and she was a delightful 91-year-old and had vivid memories of how she had changed the Episcopal Church. Her story cannot be told without her relationship to John Hines, and his story cannot be told without Lueta Bailey. There were two heroes who were friends from this story began. Two remarkable people, each in their own way. They would change the Episcopal Church forever. One was a bishop who was called to change the direction of the church. And one was a woman demanded that women their rightful place in the leadership of the church, and she, and with her strong vision, helped make this happen. This story has many chapters and this 40 minutes that lets these two people tell their own story. We'll start with Lueta Bailey, who describes a visit to the women's group in Savannah, where she was told she and her husband then became a part of the civil rights family movement. So hopefully now we're ready.
Segregation was everywhere and trouble everywhere. And I had told some of the women's auxiliary work and so forth. And I brought up what had happened to me during what was going on, and how I had felt that I had to do the right thing, and that my husband agreed, and he and I both had changed some of our actions, and I told him about being in a group at St. George's Church, and how we worked on Sunday afternoons, and the Klan would come and walk around, and the police would come and take our tag numbers. We also, it was not a white group meeting, it was a white and black group meeting that way. And we did a lot of work in this town. And I had said that there were so many things that the women needed to know and do. And I got home and, they told me when I went to the airport that they did not appreciate my coming over and that they would not pay any of my expenses. And I said, that's perfectly all right. But I later got a check from their rector with an apology. But those were the times, and I've been involved. I don't mind saying it. I had never walked. I never did anything. But the one thing I did do, have you ever been to Sewanee?
Yeah.
Well, unknown to me, I was up there bringing a provincial group of diocesan presidents, and in this province, we were having a meeting with the lay men of the province. And I told them well in advance at Sewanee that we had to have a place for a luncheon, and that I wanted them to know that one of the women was a black woman from South Carolina, because they had two groups of women, one with a white group and one with a dark black group, and each one had a president. And I said, that president always comes, and I'm going to see to it that she comes to Sewanee to this meeting. But I want to tell you in advance, she is one of us, and I want her there. I got there. She got there, and I called her and told her that I would pick her up and I would take her to lunch, that we were having our luncheon. So I took my car and went over and got her and drove on over to Clara's restaurant. And we were to go in at noontime. I got there, and it was either a DAR or one of those southern groups that had just had their lunch, and they were coming out. Everybody saw me coming in with a black woman. And I didn't pay any attention, because I said, they told me that they had lunch for us. I took her on in with me, and I saw to it that she sat to my right with her back. I don't know what made me do this, but she could not be seen front-wise. She could be seen back-wise, but she could not see what was going on in the restaurant. Well, we got through, had the lunch and everything, and we left, and I got back in the car, and I said, have you ever been to Sewanee before? And she said, no, this is my first time. And I said, well, I've been up here so much, I would like to show you what Sewanee is. We drove all the way around, zip, 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 zip. That night, it was about, I guess it was right after supper at 7 o'clock. We had a combined meeting, and the vice chancellor was there. And he knew me well. And he came over to me and sat by me and said, I think you need to call your husband. And I said, why do I want to call Seton right now? He said, because unless you don't know it, you desegregated Clara's restaurant today. Said the clergy had been coming and sitting on the front and having posters and trying to get everything done and getting it done, and she refused to do it. And said, we went over before you got here and said that we had to have a place for this person to have dinner with my group. And the vice chancellor said, I said to her, do you know Lueta Bailey? And she said, of course I know Lueta Bailey. She and her husband come here all the time. And he said, well, she's the one who's bringing it in. How would you like to have her bring in and desegregate your restaurant? And she said, that's the only person I would let do it. And he said, you're going to be in the newspaper in the morning. I said, I didn't know I was doing that. He said, we knew you didn't know it, and we weren't going to tell you until after it was over. And he said, you had a policeman following you everywhere you went, and said, you happened to have to take that person all around the Sewanee, and said that man had to follow you everywhere you were, and you didn't notice? I said, no, because cars are always behind you. And so that's the one thing that has always tickled me. I never knew I was doing it, but Clara was so excited, and everything, all of her waiters and waitresses except one or two left her that day, would refuse to serve anybody else and wouldn't come anywhere close to us. And so that was one thing.
That's a pretty amazing story.
But I did it and the clergy didn't.
You know,
During that time, did you think, we're going to talk a little later about when you were presiding bishop of the church, but during those years, did you think that you might ever be, or did you want to be, or did you want not to be, or what was your attitude toward the position of the presiding bishop of the church?
It was the furthest, most remote possibility from my mind. It never entered my mind.
You really didn't think that you might wind up there?
Absolutely not.
Interesting.
This was something which I indicated to my wife when we made the trip to St. Louis, where the election was in 1964. And after the election had occurred, which we'll be talking about later on, I could not face my wife, because we both knew that we really would end our days in Texas, which we did not.
And then life often has other plans for us, doesn't it?
The Washington Cathedral is the scene of solemn ceremonies as a new presiding bishop is installed to head the Episcopal Church in the United States. A procession of prelates winds into the edifice, which is consecrated as the Cathedral Church of St. Peter and St. Paul. The new presiding bishop is the Right Reverend John E. Hines, who is the 22nd to hold this high post. The bishop comes from Texas, but will now divide his time between Washington and the Episcopal National Center in Connecticut. Investiture ceremonies will make him the spiritual head of 3.5 million Episcopalians in the United States. The Standard Book of Common Prayer is held by its custodian and the President of the House of Deputies as Bishop Hines takes his oath of office. In his inaugural sermon, Bishop Hines calls for a return to Christ-centered preaching to lead church members out of a maze of theological speculation. The new presiding bishop brings to his office the evangelical background of his low church membership. Thus, it is expected there will be new emphasis on preaching as opposed to the more ceremonial forms of worship. May he serve long and faithfully.
Bishop Hines, you were elected presiding bishop in 1964.
That's correct.
You were not only the youngest one ever elected, but they said that the election was unexpected at the time. At least it certainly was to you.
Absolutely.
What were your thoughts as you found out you had been elected and as you accepted the post?
And I think the general consensus through the church, and I certainly felt so, was that Bishop Bain would be the next presiding bishop. So
it was a kind of a shock.
It was indeed a great shock to me to read the elections. The election came on the 6th ballot, and I was totally stunned, and though no one will believe it, I was speechless.
Really?
Bishop Lichtenberger asked me to come to the front of the cathedral where the election was, and I could simply find no voice for a period of moments, and then I said, "You're looking at a very frightened man, and I will need your prayers," and so will the church. And never were truer words spoken than that. But that was how the election went.
How long did it take you to form priorities as your tenure began? Because I imagine you began fairly soon thinking about what you were going to do in that post.
Mr. Downs, I'd like to tell you that I went to New York and I framed programs, and I was a competent administrator, and I did this and that, none of which would be true, and I can't afford to tell you and tell anybody who happens to be listening to our conversation now. I knew pretty well what the office of a diocesan bishop involved. Mm-hmm. I'd spent 10 years as a coadjutor and 10 years as a diocesan, so that I was more than dry behind the ears in that regard. But I also knew that the presiding bishop's office is almost a totally different situation and almost a totally different entity. So when I went to New York, I had a great vacancy in my mind. I did not know what a presiding bishop was supposed to do or be, and I did not know what was expected of me. and I went with fear and trembling. So as a result of that, what happened was that I did not set the agenda for the national church. The world set the agenda for the national church, because the world exploded in the United States just about the time I became presiding bishop. And the social order, which had been creaking and groaning at its seams all along for the past few years, erupted in the rioting and destruction of the cities of this nation. And that set the agenda for most of my years as presiding bishop.
I was in Highlands, North Carolina, and my husband and I were walking down the street, the main street, and he said to me, "Do you see that man down in front of us coming toward us with the two young boys with him?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "That is someone that I want you to meet. His name is John Hines." And said, one of these days you may need to see him and talk to him. And we went down, and that's how I met Bishop Hines. He had a house in Highlands, and from that point on, we always saw him. And as the years went by, they would come to my house, and sometimes he would come early to go play tennis with my husband, and we would have lunch in the kitchen. And that's one thing that when I went around later on and going into dioceses and everything, and people began complaining about Bishop Hines and everything, I would always say, "I don't really know what you're talking about. I just know the man that sits in my kitchen and eats lunch." And usually that stopped them from saying any more.
You went to Selma, Alabama also to march with Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. What was that experience like, and did you consider it at the time a sort of lobbying act on the part of voting rights?
Well, I went to march at the time of the death of the Unitarian minister there, who was slain, and I saw it as a responsibility of the symbolic head of the Episcopal Church, the presiding bishop, to indicate that at least through the presiding bishop's office, the church has a concern about the black man and also the white man in a situation in which there are conflicting points of view and opinions about their status and about dealing with liberty and freedom and the dignity of the human race. So I went primarily to say that as far as this symbolic head of the Episcopal Church is concerned, the church has got to be concerned here and has got to do its best to make its witness. Sure. It was a frightening experience, but it was also one about which I had no regrets. I had talked to the then Bishop of Alabama about my coming there. He had attempted to discourage me. He felt that my presence there would be the intrusion of outside influences that the Episcopal Church in Alabama could well exercise its responsibilities there, and I was neither necessary, and the implication was that I would not be very welcome.
Summer of '67, you had walked the streets of Bedford-Stuyvesant and Detroit during the riots and resolved to lead the church to action in that sphere also. Was that a kind of conversion experience? You had strong views on that issue already. What happened there?
Yes, I think that was a decisive experience for me. That's why I went to Bedford-Stuyvesant. I went to Detroit. I went to Watts. I went to Newark. And I walked those streets with Mr. Leon Modesti, a black staff member of our staff.
I met him at the subway which was so typical of Hines. You know, he could have had a limousine and what have you, but he took the subway. He came up and was in a business suit, and that's how I described him. Said, you know, he's a worker like I am at the Episcopal Church, but he does have some contacts. And we went around. I remember he was really impressed. There was a little girl about 3 years old or so on the stoop, and her mother had just put her out there, told her, you know, and she was neatly dressed, a bow in her hair and all like that, and you could see that this mother was really trying hard with all this other stuff that was around, and he that kind of shook him up a bit, you know, when he said, you know, what's the future for this little girl?
At the General Convention in Seattle in 1967, you had called for what has been described as the most radical and ambitious national program carried out by a white American church in the field of race relations. Now, the church responded by authorizing $9 million over 3 years as enabling money for community-based organizations to help the poor to gain an effective voice in decisions that were affecting their lives. It was agreed that the money should be under the control of those who are largely both black and poor. Is that a fair statement of that proposal? What happened with that?
The whole business of what became the General Convention Special Program stemmed from the situation with which the United States was confronted, especially among its racial minorities and ethnic minorities. And it entered into the church by virtue of this fact. The particular incidents that brought it to the attention of the church and brought it to the attention of the United States society in general, of course, were the riots which broke out in the cities. That if the Episcopal Church really wanted to make a difference, then it had to be true to its own gospel. You know, it had to try to overcome this huge gulf between its rhetoric and its actions. And as far as they could see, if the Episcopal Church wanted to do something about this whole area of oppressed and discriminated and poor people, they had to do it with money and expertise, which the Episcopal Church would have to do without any strings attached, you know, to get away from the old paternalistic, we'll give you the money if you'll do what we think you ought to do. But to say to them, we'll give you an opportunity and we'll give you the money to do your best, to shape your own destiny and to control it as best you can in a hostile, discriminatory society. And that's what came about at the General Convention in Seattle. And it was something.
I had been called to New York in August to hear what Bishop Hines was going to say to the Program and Budget Committee of General Convention. And I was also told that it had to do with money coming from the United Thank Offering. But we had already arranged for the money to be spent in the United Thank Offering, and they thought I should be there and hear all of that. We went in, and there were the men all seated on one side, and there were Fran Young and Dorothy Higley and Lueta Bailey on the other side, and Bishop Hines started talking. And he made this statement that he had been looking at poverty and all of the bad things that he had seen and how he had suddenly realized so much needed to be done, that he had decided to have a fund brought in from General Convention, and he said, and I am saying to the United Thank Offering of the women that I want $3 million. And I was there, and all of a sudden I said, "That's not right," to myself. I said, "That's not right." And I spoke out, and I said, "Bishop Hines, you can't do that to the United Thank Offering." And he looked at me and like, "What are you talking about?" I said, "Bishop Hines, you have to make an application for money from the United Thank Offering. And we have planned for a large sum of money to go to people who have applied for money from the United Thank Offering at this triennial meeting." And he looked strangely, and all of the men looked at me, and they were kind of grinning that I had said something like that. So we left it. He said, "I'll be thinking about it." Well, afterwards, I went to him and I said, you really do have to make an application. And I know you're going to speak at our triennial meeting, but you're going to have to ask us for money. You can't say, "Give me that money." So that changed all of the program of the triennial meeting. And on a Monday morning, we had been there almost a week. We had a plan to have a floor discussion and then a decision. These women had been having small groups, each diocese every afternoon. Bishop Bennett Sims, he was not the bishop at that time, but he was our chaplain who stayed with us all of the time. And every afternoon he went around all of the dioceses, and they were having all kinds of conversations. Deputies, men from their own diocese, were coming in and trying to make them say that they wouldn't do it and that they should not vote for it. It made all of us a little uneasy about how it was going, but we let them go ahead and talk, and we knew where we were. And on Monday morning, we went in, and my parliamentarian had worked out for me a plan by which we could make it easier for everybody. Not any of us on the national board, the General Division of Women's Work, made any statement during that discussion that would make the people know whether we were for it or against it. Bishop Hines had made his speech, and he had done exactly what I had asked him to do. He asked, but he told why he was asking. Instead of saying, "Give me $3 million, he asked, would we consider and give it? Well, we finally had the discussion, and Dorothy Higley, who was the president of our General Division of Women's Work at that time, made a statement, and that was the only statement that was done. She told how she felt about it. We had fixed a plan where they voted by dioceses and not by individuals. They had their own votes together, and then each diocese stood up and said, "We are yes," or "We are no." And of course, you know how it happened. It was a great vote to give Bishop Hines that money. And along about that time came the House of Deputies, and they were furious with us because we had voted before they had. But that's the way we had it.
So then after that, talk to us about women being seated at General Convention.
Oh, that was a fun day. It was not we didn't know what was going to happen. I had been invited to come over that day anyway to the House of Deputies. I knew that I was going over, and all of the women had been invited to come when I was going to be there, and they were to sit in the balcony, and they could not be on the floor. and they sat there, and they were to sit there. So I had planned to go. But then I found out that they were going to vote on the women being seated in the House. So I didn't know what was going to happen. But as we started the triennial meeting that morning, and we did the money for Bishop Hines first of all, I sent someone to go and listen to what was going on over there. And if it turned out to be negative, to get to us immediately. And then we could not tell the women anything about what was happening if it was bad. We had to wait until we had a message, an official message from the House of Deputies. So we got our work all done, and I kept saying, I wonder what they're doing over there, to the parliamentarian. I wonder when we're going to get it. And all of a sudden, we were told that the House had voted very well to seat women. And immediately, I got a message from the those who sent the messages from House of Deputies that I would be expected. They wanted me to come at 1 o'clock that afternoon. And so I was all ready and ready to go. All the women decided they would go too, and so they went up and sat in the balcony. And I was greeted by, I believe, 3 men. And they were the ones who had the orchid in their hand, and they pinned it to my jacket, and then gave me the card that said that it was celebration, and we walked down the aisle. Now, the House of Deputies is not supposed to, the people who are deputies are not supposed to ever use a camera inside the meeting. I walked down, and I kept hearing this noise, click, click, and I looked, and both sides were completely covered with men making pictures of what was going on. And then we went up, and I was introduced, and my husband was a deputy at that time, and he was called to the platform. And later he told me that he had been furious because he hadn't been asked to walk down the aisle with me. But then they made quite a speech for him, and then I made my little short speech. I had 2 messages made, but one was that I was going to tell them how disappointed I was in them, and the other one was I told them how glad I was. I told them how long we had waited so long. And then I went out, and I found that at the doorway, a bishop was waiting for me. And the bishop said, Bishop Hines wants you to come into the House of Bishops. And he wants to let you know how the House of Bishops feels. And so I was escorted over there. And when I got there, I walked up to the platform. Bishop Hines threw his arms around me and kissed me. And then he turned to the whole house and he said, "You're not allowed to do that." And that was it. I made a little short speech there, but it was a great day. Everybody was excited.
So 2 wonderful things happened at that convention. The 1970 convention, when you could actually be seated. Tell us about that.
Well, that was exciting too. We were called in, all of us who had been elected were called in the day before it opened. Dr. Coburn, the presiding officer or servant in the House of Deputies, talked to us and made some statements to us and knew that we were going to be seated, even though he didn't know whether they were going to vote it or not. He didn't know either. And then we were told that we could not be seated until that vote was taken, but then we would be seated. And so then the next morning he had us all around again, and I was already on the platform and made my little short speech about thanking them and how long it had been and crazy things like that. But anyway, it was very short because I wanted to get the vote done so we could all be seated. And I believe Atlanta diocese was the first one to be called when they seated the women, and I was the one that sat there. And that was kind of fun. And we were immediately in that, during that day, John Coburn gave us all a place on different committees. We were immediately put on committees so that women would be men would see women involved in all of the committees. I remember being put on Christian social relations, and I thought, well, I'll never get out of that. But every single one of us was put on a committee.
With their deputations.
Will the newly elected women deputies please be seated in their places with their dioceses? Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, this action is just like the gospel's action. The gospel always comes with judgment on our past and with grace for our present and our future. Grace forgives, reconciles, makes whole. So we are now in process in this body of being made whole. The newly elected deputies come to us as bearers of the gospel of both judgment and grace to make us whole, holy as the people of God. So we welcome them as members of the body to make us more truly representative of Christ's body and spirit. They also bring us something that the House has needed desperately for a long time, some beauty. So as a spokesman for these bearers of judgment, grace, and beauty, I welcome one as a spokesman for them, Mrs. Seton Bailey of the Diocese of Atlanta. Mrs. Bailey.
Mr. President and fellow deputies, this is indeed an historic occasion in the history of the Episcopal Church. All Episcopalians feel proud of this convention's recognition of women as persons, which is a reconciling symbol in a period of much separation and division. In the name of women, how good it is to be here in this place. Thank you.
There had been various attempts over the decades to seat women deputies, but they'd always been turned aside. But many dioceses in the triennium between 67 and 70 had elected women as deputies with the expectation that they would be seated when they got to Houston. So when we began the Houston Convention, again, I was a deputy from the Diocese of Texas. The House of Bishops saw to it that the constitutional amendment was the first order of business when they met in Houston, and they sent a message over to the House of Deputies that they had adopted this constitutional amendment. The House of Deputies was waiting for that, and so it was put to a vote by orders in the House of Deputies. It passed, not unanimously, but it passed. And we had a platoon of 20 or 22 women waiting in the hall because they expected to be seated because they'd been elected by their respective home dioceses. And I never shall forget, the entire male House of Deputies stood up and applauded, and the women came down the aisle and greeted their deputations, and it was a grand and glorious moment.
So here's a little ending thing. When Lueta was getting ready for the first appearance for the House of Deputies, for the first vote on seating the women in 1967, she said, "I decided early that morning to wear a red silk suit and announced to the whole triennial meeting." Deputies voted no. I was dressed properly as a martyr. And if they said yes, I was dressed properly for celebration. So today I wrote red to support what she did. I think we have, I would thank the Mark Duffy at the Episcopal Archives for the photos and the John, his Gobern's things. So now we can have questions if you would like to have some.
Well, I want to read for you, Robin, a couple of comments that came in. Pan McCaslin wrote, "So grateful for Charlie and his vision to capture our history on video." And I second that motion. Elizabeth Ring wrote, "I'm so glad you're recording this. It's reminding me of two dear women from Maine, Charity Weymouth and Mary Flagg, who were part of these changes. This is a treasure." And I think that is the best statement that could be made here. This is a treasure, because this is an incredible recording of history of the Episcopal Church. And thank you both for sharing this.
Sometimes with this old video, sometimes gets kind of garbled in the sound, but
Sure.
yeah. So,
But it was pretty good, I thought. Did anyone else have a question at all? Someone added, Heather Huck added, "It is also crucial background for the efforts to get women ordained as deacons and priests. In
yes.
2 years, we'll celebrate 50 years. That is right. You're right about that.
And that first step for the women to be seated and have votes, that's what paved the way where women could then be made priests.
So, is there anyone else that wanted to
Is there anything else? There seemed there was quite a few things in chat. Should we look?
Where I'm reading. I'm reading these from chat.
Yeah.
Here's another one. "Great job, Sandra Squire. So fascinating. This is one of many steps, opening the seminaries, deaconesses being recognized, and the Philadelphia ordinations too. Hike." So, yes, they're wonderful things.
I wanted it to do in their own voices as much as possible. Because, and we're talking about women, but John Hines was absolutely behind everything women wanted, and very
instrumental.
Yeah. We have another little piece of video that maybe someday we'll use, but he, in 1972, I guess it was, he maybe 73, at that general convention, he said there is no reason women should not be ordained, and he got boos all over the place.
Oh gosh.
But he did it.
But he said it, yes.
Said it, that's right.
Yes. And as Pan McCaslin adds, his wife was an advocate as well.
Yes.
And Joan Gunderson says, Bishop Hines seemed to have a fair amount of hubris in deciding that he could just take control of the United Thank Offering, but he adjusted. That's beautifully put.
Yes, he really thought he could, and she said, no, you can't do that.
You can't.
Right.
You can ask for it. Yes.
And please. The reason I asked the picture of Philip Mascolet was because he wept. He wept.
That was wonderful. Yeah.
I thought it was just a wonderful thing for him that he felt that, and I think there were many people who wept when those women came.
And Heather Huck added this, talking about Bishop Hines. Then his successor said after Philadelphia, the ladies are not priests.
Yes. Wasn't true though.
Right.
That's
right.
The women won.
Well, it's time again for us to go, and I hope you will come back next week to hear about Bishop Harris. I hope you all will go to our website, ewip.org, to see what we're doing and to see if you may want to join us. We would love to have you as part of our mission. And if you have any stories that you feel are important to hear, please let us know about those. We'd love to focus on them and share them with others.
Yes.
Again, have a happy and holy Lent. We're right in the middle of it now. And we all are praying for the church in the Ukraine and hoping that this war will end. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, and we hope to see you next week.
Great.